So I'm going to walk you through some of the autism data coming from the DDS department, and I have a lot to go through, so I'm going to be blazing fast, so everybody buckle up. All right, so I work for the Department of Developmental Services. This is the state agency responsible for overseeing service provision for individuals with disabilities in the state in accordance with the Lanterman Act. And our department contracts with 21 independent regional centers across the state. The 21 regional centers are vendorizing the service providers who directly provide services and supports to individuals, and the regional centers also provide local case management to individuals. My department also oversees state-operated services. I'm not going to talk about those now, but we will talk about some of those in the DDS presentation that's coming this afternoon. Okay, so our department is responsible for setting broad policies and priorities for the state service delivery system, while the regional centers are responsible for direct coordination of services for individuals. And I think we provide over 150 different types of services, so the regional centers are responsible for providing a lot of supports for individuals in the state. Okay, to be eligible for those services, you have to have a qualifying disability, which includes intellectual disability, autism, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and our fifth category, which would be any disability that is similar to an intellectual disability. That disability has to originate before age 18, and it also has to constitute a substantial disability. And what that means is it's having some kind of impact on functioning in any, or in at least 3 of the areas that are listed here. Okay, so the regional centers collectively serve 327,000 individuals, but the number that are served by each regional center depends on the catchment area. So Redwood Coast is serving the smallest number of individuals at 3,800, whereas Inland Regional Center is serving the largest number at just shy of 35,000 individuals. But regardless of the number that are served at each regional center is going to provide every single individual that they serve with a service coordinator. And that service coordinator is the one who helps come up with a plan that includes the services that are needed, and the service coordinator is also the one who helps purchase those services. Okay, so now I'm going to dig into our data, and before I get started with that, I just want to preface this so that you're all aware. The data I'm presenting is from our service delivery system. So these are the data of individuals who are being served by the regional centers. So there are other individuals in the state who may have a diagnosis of autism who are not being served by our system. Those individuals are not going to be in the counts that I'm talking about today. This data is only individuals who are consumers of the regional centers in California, okay? So the total number of consumers served is 327,000, and that's a 42% increase from 10 years ago. And out of that 327,000, 106,000 of those individuals have a diagnosis of autism. Okay, so this is a breakdown of who we serve by the proportion in our 5 diagnostic categories. And I should note, these categories are not mutually exclusive, so you might notice that the percentages don't add up to a perfect 100%. That's because some individuals have more than one diagnosis, and that's going to be represented here. But I do want to draw your attention to the very left side. That's autism. We currently serve 38% who have autism, and you'll notice those bars are going up. So over the past 10 years, we are seeing an increase in the number of individuals who have autism who are being served, whereas all of the other diagnostic categories, we see a decline. All right, so let's dig into the data that's specific to autism. Over the past 10 years, we've seen a 175% increase in the number of individuals who have autism in our system. Okay, that's a huge increase. And the graph here shows the number of individuals binned by their age group, and what may be a little striking to you is they're very clustered to the left side, which would be younger ages. So we have the bulk of our individuals being served in childhood, and in fact, 80% of those who have autism are under age 22. So The vast majority of the individuals in the regional center system who have autism are currently children, but of course those children are growing up. And as those children are growing up, we're going to see a dramatic shift in our service delivery system, because within the next 10 to 15 years, autism is going to represent the majority of our adults in our regional center system. Okay, this is what the data looks like in the Bay Area. This is including East Bay and Golden Gate regional centers, and you'll see the data looks pretty similar here. The increase is also very close, 177% increase over the last 10 years, and again, you'll see about 80% of the individuals are under 22. Okay, we've also seen a shift in terms of the racial and ethnic makeup of our population. So over the last 10 years, we've seen our Hispanic population with autism increase from a 28% share to 37% of our population of individuals with autism, while the population of individuals with autism who are white has declined from 40% to 31%. Okay, so we're seeing this shift. And this is similar in the Bay Area, and it's also a similar change across all of the consumers we serve in the regional center system. And I think this is something that's going to be really, really important to consider when we think about service delivery and ensuring that our services are going to be culturally and linguistically appropriate and accessible to every single Californian with a disability. Okay, looking at residence type. For individuals with autism in the state, we haven't seen a significant shift over the last 10 years. The majority of individuals are living in the home of a parent or guardian. But if you remember, I just mentioned the bulk of our individuals with autism in our system are children, so that makes sense that most of them would be living at home with a parent or guardian. But if we look specifically at the adults with autism who may have different living arrangements, over the last 10 years, we have seen a shift where in 2008, 45% of our adults with autism were living at home with a parent or guardian. That's now 69%. So we've actually seen an increase in the number of adults with autism who are living at home with a parent or guardian. Okay, we haven't seen any changes in the proportion of males to females with autism, so that's remained steady at a 5-to-1 ratio, 5 males for every 1 female with autism in our system. We have seen a change in individuals who have or have not or do not have a co-occurring intellectual disability. The biggest shift would be individuals with autism who do not have a co-occurring intellectual disability. We've seen that proportion increase from 69% 10 years ago to 81% of the individuals served today.
Laura, can you do me a favor?
Yeah.
People don't understand what that means, the IQ of 70 cutoff. Can you explain?
Like who would have
Yeah,
a disability?
who's considered to have an intellectual disability? Because sometimes people with very significant disabilities aren't considered that way.
Right, so an intellectual disability would be based on IQ or your intellectual quotient. So the cutoff's going to be around 70 or 75. So anyone who's above that, who's in the normal or above average IQ range, would be considered not having a co-occurring intellectual disability. Okay, so the majority here are individuals who are not qualifying, so they don't have an IQ that would be like below 70. Okay. So each individual in our system who is determined eligible for services through the regional centers has a Client Development Evaluation Report, or CDER, and in that report, it describes their autism diagnosis, and it includes a condition impact score, which is the closest thing we would have to an autism severity rating for each individual. The condition impact score is based on the extent of an individual's services. So, for example, it would be based on how much supervision or direct care someone might have. The ratings would be mild, moderate, or severe, depending on how many services and what type an individual needs. Across the state, we haven't seen any shift in the breakdown of the condition impact for autism. So we've been stable. Around 65% would be in the moderate range, around 25% would be considered mild, around 10% are in the severe range based on their CDER condition impact score. But what I thought was really interesting is in the Bay Area, we actually have seen a change. In 2008, the moderate range was about 65% of the population served here. In 2018, that grew to 82%. At this point, it's not clear to me whether that's an actual shift in severity in the area or whether it's more of a trend based on the scoring that's happening at the regional center level here. But either way, that's going to have implications for the types of services that are needed, specifically in the Bay Area here. Okay, so the last piece I have to talk about here is looking at the age of eligibility. So this is when an individual is determined to be eligible for Lanterman services. This is not including those who are in early start. But looking at children ages 3 to 12, when they are determined eligible, the average age has not changed from 2008 to 2018. That's remained stable at 4.7 years. But if you take a look at the graph, you'll see 48% are determined eligible at age 3. So we do see the largest proportion of children being determined eligible are 3, but we do see children being determined eligible at all of the other age groups in smaller proportions. And so we haven't seen that shift in terms of age range, but if we look at the numbers, you'll notice the number of children being determined eligible for services at 3 years of age has grown from 1,500 in 2008 to 6,000 within the last year. Okay, so we've seen a huge increase in the number of 3-year-olds who are entering our service delivery system, which is really big. Okay, so I think at this point I'm probably out of time, so I'm gonna wrap up with a few conclusions. So based on the data I'm showing you here, you can see we do have a changing landscape of who's being served in our state. We have an increasing number of individuals with autism. They're increasingly diverse, and they have a changing set of needs. And that's gonna have strong implications for me, specifically in terms of the policy directions and priorities that we need looking ahead to the future. And making sure that we're going to have the right services and supports for our increasingly large and diverse population as they become adults in our system. So I personally hope to be collaborating with stakeholders here and across the state to help meet that need. I will be here all day, so if you do have any input for me, please find me during a break or during the breakout sessions. I really want to talk to all of you, honestly, so please don't be shy, okay?
Thanks, Lauren. We have time actually for one question. If someone wants to shout out one question, we can do one. Oh, Feda, who knew? Yeah, here, just use this.
So when you were talking about the score, the functionality score,
Condition impact score.
condition impact score, and you were saying that's based on functionality or service level. So is the score based on the level of services does that person have? So basically, is it after the fact they get the score or before they get the services?
Lisa might be a better person to answer that question.
They get that score based when they're first come in to the system and the CEDAR is first completed.
So it has nothing to do with like, okay, this person gets more services. So you could have a score of 3 and have no services.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was my question.
Good question, Feda.
Yeah, great
That was
question.
surprising. That was a good question. Okay, Feda is the Vice President of Autism Society, San Francisco Bay Area. All right, so thank you so much. We are now going to turn to the Regional Center Directors Forum, and the format for this is pretty simple. We have 6 prepared questions. We're going to try to spend approximately 10 minutes on each question. That adds up to an hour, and then we're all hungry, and we get out of here for lunch. If you have questions, I would recommend that you go to one of the lunch groups with one of these people or nab them in the hall afterwards. Okay? So I'm going to first introduce, hi, Gabriel. Long time no see. Gabriel Rogan, Executive Director of the North Bay Regional Center. Eric Zigman, GGRC. Lisa Kleinbub, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, from Regional Center of the East Bay, and I'm a SARC person, so my own Executive Director, Javier Zaldivar. Thank you so much for being here. All right, I'm going to start with this question. What I'll do is I'll toss it out to one of you to start, and then other people can chime in. All right? So we all know that the regional centers have been facing a lot of challenges over the past several years. And I just want to ask you, what do you see as the 2 or 3 biggest challenges your regional center is currently facing? I'll start with Lisa.
Okay, let me make sure the mic's on here. I think when I think about the biggest challenges we have, one of the most significant issues is the rates that we are able to fund services at. So our rates really are reflective of old formulas, have been frozen since 2008, and have really limited us on how creative we can be in terms of developing services. I think that those frozen rates or really restrictive rates have impacted things like our service providers having staff in the area, because at those rates, people cannot afford to live in the Bay Area, at least in the central locations of the Bay Area. Housing is one of the most significant issues that we have. People cannot afford to acquire housing at that rate that someone with SSI can afford housing, and most of our adult consumers are, at least initially as young adults, dependent on SSI or low-wage
Hold it
income.
just a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, usually I'm holding it too far away. Anyway, so SSI housing availability is not there. There are also not enough Section 8 vouchers and low-income affordable housing created in the Bay Area. And I think the other thing that is really impacting us and is a challenge, but really quite an opportunity, is as we look at the diversity of our population in the Bay Area, we are seeing the need for different models of services. Thank you, Eric. We are currently looking at how we serve the population of people who speak monolingual Asian language speaking families who have told us that they want services that reflect how they live in their culture, which is with family members, but adults also want to have their own space. So we're looking at new models for housing and also how people will live, looking at family home agencies, and we're looking at that model also for people who use ASL as their language. So many different things.
Just quickly explain
Yeah.
what family home agency
A family home agency is an agency that is vendored by a regional center, and they identify housing in people's homes where people provide support to individuals who live in their homes. We think that there may be opportunities for people to live in homes that are the house of a person who uses ASL as their primary language, which might be something people want. Also, some monolingual Asian language families believe there are people in the community who would provide that support.
Right, think of FHA as a adult foster care, just like we do for children when we look for unique situations. So we try to follow that same model with the adult population, where many families will bring them into their home and they become part of the family and much more uniquely situated to meet the needs of the individuals.
And
Go ahead, Eric.
okay, and I would just add, it's almost like Lisa read from my notes. No, we all have the same answers to this, but the thing to understand about the first thing, the incredibly important thing she said, is that the connection between the cost of providing services and the rates paid for services was broken completely in 2008. It had been broken previously for a lot of services that were cost-based, but the same is true for regional centers. So you have an underfunded system that really is the root cause. Now, I usually talk about social justice and civil rights, but lately I've been saying it's about not making the investment into the system that will let us meet some of these challenges. On all the ones that Lisa outlined were definitely ones I was going to talk about. The other one that's sort of a little more esoteric is we are conceived as 501c3 nonprofits to be change agents in the community, to be leadership organizations, to make things better, to meet the needs of your sons and daughters. It's very difficult for us to do that in caseload ratios with our social workers or service coordinators having 80 or 90 cases when they're federally mandated to have 62 to 66. So the advocacy piece that needs to go on, there'll be a rate study being finished by March of 2019 for provider rates, and we need the entire community to push to get the government to fund those things.
Not to belabor the point about rates, but we are all fairly desperate to increase service capacity. We all know there are many families out there who are in real urgent need of services. But we all are dealing with this dynamic where we are trying to create new services at the same time some of our existing service providers are going out of business. So it's a real problem. We all have group homes closing, day programs closing, et cetera, and some of those service providers that are in existence and are able to maintain their services are having a hard time finding staff. So we're at a point where something's really got to give. We're putting a lot of hope in this rate reform effort that's happening right now, and hopefully that study will produce something meaningful. Housing, I think, is another point where we're really at a crisis now. If we don't do something about housing, you could have as many great services as you want. If people don't have a place to live in your community, it's going to be very hard to serve them. I would add a few other things that we've been experiencing in the North Bay. One is we're having a hard time finding therapists for our 0 to 3 population, speech therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists. I think that is a function of rates, but it's also, there just aren't enough professionals willing to do that work or wanting to do that work, so we're working very hard to do more outreach and recruitment. And then I would add families with children with real significant behaviors in the home. We all have crisis services that accompany our regional centers, but what we're hearing is it's not enough. Families really struggling with aggression or self-injurious behaviors. They don't want to have their son or daughter leave the home. That's really a last resort, but they really need that extra support to keep them in the home and keep them and the rest of their families safe. So we're really trying to beef up our crisis response and crisis prevention so we can work proactively with families to just maintain a more stable dynamic.
I simply want to add that San Andreas covers 4 counties. We have Santa Clara County, Monterey, San Benito, and Santa Cruz County. And it always provides a unique challenge as we look at the individual communities. But in Santa Clara County alone, one of the biggest challenges that we are facing is the local minimum wage. We have 7 different minimum wages in Santa Clara County, but the rates remain the same. And the amount of work that it takes for a vendor just to get to a level where they can support their staff is staggering on their part and on the regional center part. So the local minimum wages are really, really having a serious impact. I can go to Starbucks, own one, and no problem, I'm going to raise my cup of coffee by 5 cents. Unfortunately for our vendors, they cannot do that. And they have to live within the means. And unfortunately for the department up in Sacramento, they don't have a mechanism to immediately adjust for local minimum wage. And frankly, the governor doesn't support it anyway, if they did have it. But that aside, there is no mechanism. And another, I think, real serious challenge that we're having, and I am going to go out on a limb and say many of you have probably experienced it, and it ties hand in hand with rates, and that is the quality of the staff. There are many, many times when a vendor is struggling to get hired and to bring quality people on. And I'm not saying that the people they're bringing on aren't quality, but there is a difference. This is hard work in many instances. And there was a time when people would put their heart into the job and make it work, make it a career. And nowadays, we are competing with In-N-Out Burger, where their starting wage is higher than what we can do. And when we're looking at being able to create a system that is sustainable and long-term, and where a lot of the success, you all know it, for people with autism is built on relationship and being able to trust and being able to know the individual. But when we have a revolving door of people just because we can't get people, and it really, really provides an opportunity for a disaster in many cases. And then finally, what is really, really challenging is just being able to sustain it. Just since June of 2018 at San Andreas Regional Center, we have had 6 residential facilities close. They cannot keep up. We've had a respite program close. They cannot keep up. We've had 2 after-school programs close. They cannot keep up. We've had a day program on the verge of closing. They cannot keep up. We've had a transportation agency close. They cannot compete. And this is all the real data that we keep relaying back to the department. Everything funnels through. We have the local regional center, as you know, there's 21 of us, but everything funnels back to Sacramento. And it's important that we use our voice. When you see a legislator and they give you that 1-minute elevator pitch, work on that if you're in this area. It is so critical. And you heard Lauren mention that there is a dynamic shift in the kind of person we are serving, but the service models are not keeping up. The service models remain the same, stagnant, old model that just don't work for a lot of the population. So the more we can work together to change that, the better we will be for the future.
Thank you, panelists. Let's move on to the next question. All right, the answer to this question cannot be win the lottery. The question is, in your opinion, what are the most important things parents of adults with autism should do to make sure their children are well cared for after they become infirm and pass? That is, after the parents become infirm and pass. We will start with Eric.
Well, I'll move away from the advocacy part, because we're going to talk about that in the next one. But systemic change is part of it. And as I listen to us up here, we've I don't know, between us serve 120,000 individuals or something in families. And it's easy for us to get focused on the challenges, but we want you to know that there are tons of successes going on. And it's a 50-year-old system. And if you read that 4501 of Welfare and Institutions Code, it's like a preamble to the Lanterman Act. And it says that Californians accept responsibility for their individuals with developmental disabilities, and that's the thing I think we're going to need to turn to state to have this system continue. For 50 years, it's done a level job of meeting people's needs and changing over time. So I don't want people to walk away thinking this is completely impossible. We have people in employment, we have people in-home daycare, in-home day programs that are doing well. We have a lot of people who are being sustained. And so it's an evolution of the system. And in that preamble, it says part of our charge up here is to not dislocate people from their home communities. And I think accepting responsibility in California and not dislocating people from their home communities is going to be the push we ask you to do with us. In terms of what you can do for the future, I really believe that all disabilities inform identity, but they're not the same as identity. And you know that because you know your kids or the people you work with or the people you are allies with. And so what that means is that we need to see the individual, to see the identity of your loved one, and not ever have a sort of reaction that autism or cerebral palsy or anything else is brain injury is the totality of the individual. And to do that, we've turned as a system much to person-centered thinking and person-centered planning. And we are really trying, we've rededicated ourselves after 10 years at Golden Gate to really supporting our social workers and getting that done. And that means, in the kind of connecting to the theme of the conference of spectrum of choice, giving individuals that we serve experiences with different choices and options, residential, work and day, meaningful activities, all those things, and then trying to see where that person thrives, whether they have incredibly severe, difficult to communicate kind of disabilities or very mild and tons of capabilities that are like work focused. It's just trying to figure out where the best fit is. So as families, it's always tough when you're the family. You know your mom and dad had a view of you, and then the rest of the world had a view of you. It's really important for families to try to be partners with us and go through that person-centered. It may seem kind of weird to you because it's so social worky and structured, but it helps us try to get a 360 view of what your specific loved one needs to move forward into the future, and I think it'll be very valuable.
I just have a few thoughts. What often happens is people wait till they're in crisis, and then they come to the regional center and say, we have, 3 months to figure out a solution. So I think my first piece of advice would be start early. At your next meeting, just bring it up. What is the plan going to be for after I'm gone? Of course, no one's going to have the answer to that, but at least start the conversation. Second thing I would say is try to identify someone who you trust and who loves your person with a disability who will be around. That could be a family member. Often it's a family member, maybe a sibling. But if there aren't family members available, try to find someone else. Could be a vendor you have a really strong relationship with. Could be someone at the regional center. But make sure there's someone who really knows the person in your family and really cares about them. I think that's important. I would also say do your best to create an inclusive community. Make sure your loved one is connected with your neighbors somehow, that they know him or her at the grocery store. Those things may seem not that important, but imagine if you were gone, you would want to know that there are people around in your neighborhood that know the person. I think those things matter. And then I would say it comes back to housing in a big way. Develop a real specific housing plan. Is the person going to stay in your family home? Great, what's that going to look like? If not, what other options are out there? So I would start by going to take tours of different models. Familiarize yourself with what exists. And that'll take a while because there are 15 different models you could choose from. So go out there, look what's working, what isn't. Try to imagine your loved one in those different models. Is that a good fit? If it isn't, can we modify it somehow? Just start that conversation early. Partner with the regional center in that conversation. And as much as I would love to say the regional center will lead that for you, I would really advise you to take the lead in that process. You know your loved one better than anyone. You're going to be their strongest advocate. So really take the lead and push the system to follow whatever plan you set up. Obviously, you want to do it collaboratively, but to just sit back and expect the regional center to solve that, I think is probably unrealistic.
Just a couple of advice points if I were to offer them unsolicited, but here they go. One, have an honest discussion with the people that you are surrounding. You would be surprised how many times that a plan is in place and the assumption was that maybe a sibling would be the one that would take over and continue down the advocacy path. But when we talk to the sibling, that was really my parents. I really don't have this much time. So really have that honest discussion that whomever you're going to build, and as Gabriel mentioned, really looking forward, but making sure that whomever you ultimately are going to put the trust in, that that person is going to be committed and that your vision and your hopes and your dreams are going to be and continue to be representative of the actual individual that's being served. So have an honest discussion about what it is that you as a family want and who can support that when whatever happens. A lot of times you're incapacitated for another reason. And so making sure that that vision remains. And then the last thing that I have here is build a good relationship with the vendors. The people that are serving your loved one, it is always a good idea to have a good relationship so that you know that in a good relationship doesn't mean that you're not going to have challenging times and you're not going to have times when you don't see eye to eye, but you can still maintain a relationship so that when you are not there, that the loving relationship that they have with that individual will continue on regardless of your presence.
I would reiterate almost everything else that was said here. I do think that the issue of living in community and that we're in the Bay Area and we have a very diverse community that is tolerant for the most part and accepting of individuals' unique ways of being in the world. And I think that we have to embrace that. And I think that as I go through, can you hear me or am I echoing again? As you are living your life, it's like expect that people will like to meet someone who's a little different from another person in the community, that it's not a reason not to be in different places. So, and I think there is more support out there, especially I think among younger people who have grown up with a different school system than those of us who came up in the 60s and 70s. And I think there is acceptance out there, and I think we should expect that from people in the community as well as you plan.
All right, thank you so much. And for those who want to know more about planning, I recommend those green sessions because, like Javier said, like having a plan is important, and then also communicating it to your family members and friends. And so they will talk about things like, how do you write that plan in some of these sessions? Okay, number 3, how can regional centers assist individuals in securing housing when a family's financial resources are limited? We'll start with Gabriel.
So there are a number of different residential models that already exist. Group homes, and within group homes there are a number of different types. There are community care facilities, intermediate care facilities. So depending on your needs, you could go to a different type of group home. So there are 2 types of ICFs, intermediate care facilities. One is habilitative, which is more self-care, daily living, and then the other is nursing. So for those who have nursing support or need nursing support, that might be a good model for you. Within community care facilities, there are different levels, level 2, 3, 4, depending on your needs. There are also specialized residential facilities. A lot of new models have been developed with the closures of the developmental centers. So there's a number of different options. I really suggest you go out and tour. How can regional centers help? Help you familiarize yourself with what exists is one thing. Engage you in the conversation. All of us have housing nonprofits that we partner with, so they can educate you on not just the regional center models, but what exists in the broader community and how you can start planning to try to access those things. I don't know all their names, but Housing Choices, they can all tell you their name of their housing nonprofit. But we at North Bay are trying to educate our service coordinators on housing more than has been done previously. But honestly, it's a lot for service coordinators to understand. Typically, service coordinators think about services, and they're not necessarily housing experts. So if you're talking with your service coordinator about housing and you feel like you're not getting the answers that you need, feel free to escalate that conversation. I think that's a reasonable conversation to have with a supervisor, for example. Or you can ask the supervisor to connect you with the housing nonprofit of the regional center, and they can give you more specific advice. We were talking earlier about intentional communities, and I know that's kind of the $1 million conversation that's happening now. I urge people to start, if they're thinking about beginning an intentional community in a certain geographic area, to start that conversation with their regional center early. It has been the case where development has gotten 3/4 of the way down the road, and then they try to bring in the regional center, and that's challenging because it may not have been developed according to the regional center's rules or the state rules or the federal rules, and then that puts us in an awkward position. If you start with us early, I don't know if I can speak for all of us, but at least my perspective is we want to work with you. We want to figure out a way to increase housing capacity, but do it in a way that follows the rules that we have to follow. So that's my perspective.
I would just say very briefly, yeah, I'm doing it too now, that the blessing and curse of the Lanterman Act. The blessing is all the things in terms of having an entitlement and not having 100,000 people waiting for services, as was reported earlier in a different state. But some of the curse part is this insulation we have from other systems, and at Golden Gate we're working very hard in our primary, one of our 4 big goals, to break that down and reach out to other systems, including clinical systems and first responders. But in this case, I want to just mention affordable housing. Your advocacy is going to be needed in affordable housing. Most populations, quote unquote, of other folks with other issues have set-asides for them, and very few intellectual and developmental disabilities have set-asides happen. And it's particularly difficult in our system because the regional centers were set up to really pay for services and support, not the actual occupancy costs. So we need to go much bigger and really be on the radar of affordable housing initiatives so that set-asides are there, so that there is a housing stock in the future to be more integrated and more part of the community. So I would just really urge that's something that will help families, especially those with financial need.
I would just say that for anyone who expects to have financial need, being aware of any Section 8 or affordable housing opportunities that exist and starting to get on those lists as soon as you are 18 years old can be a way to, 5 years down the line, maybe all have access to affordable housing, maybe 10 years down the line. But I also think as people who have more resources are thinking about developing housing community is to always think about, is there a way that instead of having just one apartment for the individual that I care about, is there a way this could be a 2-bedroom apartment that would work for 2 people and provide additional housing opportunities that allow someone else to get housing? I know of people who've acquired a 3-bedroom home for one individual and that they work with in their family, and other people are able then to rent the other rooms. And so there are those things to think about, because I do think that is also a way to promote social justice, so everyone has a home.
On the immediate side at San Andreas, we are very committed to trying to help preserve if somebody's already in their own apartment and they start struggling financially, or there's a rent increase that is unsustainable, we will work with that individual. And in the Lanterman Act for supported living in particular, we are able to help for a certain period of time cover a portion of the rent. And in order to do that, there's a whole list of things that have to be accomplished before we get there, including taking a close look at the budget and where can we cut corners on the entertainment side, for example, in order to help ends meet and get the rent paid. So it's just a reality with the rents averaging now, $2,500 for a studio in Santa Clara County, that it's become a real pivotal. And as Eric mentioned earlier, the whole point of the Lanterman Act is to keep people in their community. And this is something that has been a real challenge, I think, for all of us. We've seen a huge spike in housing costs, unfortunately. And then we do have a fund that is not attached to purchase of service that we can tap into at times to help either with a security deposit and rent, or if somebody starts to struggle again, maybe they were working and they lost their job, they don't have that income, they can approach their service coordinator, have that discussion, and then we can always decide at that point what it is we do and don't do regarding the rent. And obviously, the fund that we have isn't a lot of money, and we try to monitor it closely. The number one request we get for tapping into that fund is for housing, either rent or some other situation related to housing. So that's some of the immediate things that we can do.
So to put the housing thing in some perspective, so I'm a special needs landlady. I have 9 developmentally disabled tenants at the moment. The classic paradigm was that you would be able to take 1/3 of your Social Security check as a disabled person and put that toward rent. Well, your Social Security check is about $900, so that's about $300. Right now, if you have, and obviously $300 isn't going to get you rent anywhere, you know that, except at Marbridge, I think. The exception to that is when you have a Section 8 voucher. Does everyone here know what that means? Some people don't. Okay. There are local housing authorities in each county, and that housing authority allocates these subsidies called Section 8, usually called Section 8 vouchers or portable housing vouchers, that subsidize the balance of the rent. So if you allocate $300 of your Social Security check to rent, and let's say your rent is $2,000, $1,700 would come from the housing authority. It's a really substantial and very vital subsidy. The issue is almost all of the wait lists, you can't even get on the wait list. Like, you can't even get on the wait list for a Section 8 voucher. And there are no exceptions for people with developmental disabilities, except every once in a while if someone is coming out of an institutional setting. So, that's the paradigm that's supposed to be working, but it obviously is completely broken. And we don't have very much to come in its place. Sometimes set asides, but that's often not an appropriate setting for some of our people. So I just wanted to give a little bit of landlord perspective on that question.
And can I just throw a commercial out in Santa Cruz County right now? For the first time in over 4 years, the Section 8 list has been opened. It will remain open until December 12th. So if you live in Santa Cruz County or know somebody in
Do you
Santa
have
Cruz
to
County,
live in Santa Cruz County to get on that list?
Yeah, well, that's the priority for Santa Cruz County, but it is the housing authority. But yes, they will tell you that you need to be there. But I encourage you, if you know somebody, go to the Housing Authority of Santa Cruz County and get yourself on the list to be on the lottery. That may eventually get you a Section 8.
Yeah, my places are all in Santa Cruz, and my tenants, I'll get Santa Cruz County Housing Authority subsidies, and that's what pays for my rice and beans to feed my kids. So, it works out. Okay, moving on to number 4. Now we're going into policy. Very, very important, although most people don't like to talk about policy, but that's what drives what services are available. So in your opinion, what are the most important federal and state policy changes we could pursue as advocates to ensure appropriate lifespan care for adults with autism? And this could include Medicaid policies, how Medicaid is funded, HUD, we're just talking about HUD funding, Social Security, and in the state level, general funding, median rate, which we've already talked about, housing policies, etc. Go ahead, Javier.
Oh boy, I get the hard one. All right, well, it's such a complicated area, and I'm going to start at the local level. And we had the opportunity with advocates to work here in Santa Clara County on Measure A. If you're in Santa Clara County, hopefully you know what Measure A was. It came before the voters 3 years ago, and the primary focus of Measure A was to have funding for long-term housing of the homeless. And in this particular case, there were very clear and very siloed definitions of what homeless was defined as. And unfortunately, many people with developmental disabilities were not in that silo. So it fundamentally excluded a lot of people. But recently at the Santa Clara Board of Supervisors, we were able to carve out a piece. We were looking for a $40 million carve-out that would be earmarked specifically for housing for people with developmental disabilities. Ultimately, the Board of Supervisors decided not to touch Measure A, but they decided to find the $40 million. And that's where we are at right now, working with our housing partners to come up with the actual work that the county needs in order to make that decision. But to get the county leaders to commit $40 million is amazing. And the $40 million, although not a lot of money, what we can do is now use that money as an incentive for developers that when they're developing their projects, that it can be earmarked, a portion of it, for people with developmental disabilities. A huge task and a huge win for the community. And I really do encourage that when you're looking at your individual county, looking at the particular resources that may or may not be available, that you always keep the people with developmental disabilities in mind, because a lot of the assumption goes, well, you're attached to the regional center, therefore you're well cared for. But unfortunately, the tenet of the regional center system is that we are always the payer of last resort. And therefore, we must tap into every other resource. So I think to be able to have been successful in that, so look at that local level, the city level. Many local cities have their planning. Every local city has to have their housing plan. And I encourage you to become familiar with that housing plan. It's the number one thing that is affecting, I think, our community. Just the sheer lack of affordable housing, or just housing in particular, is really, I think, dangerous. And although we celebrate the Googleplex coming to downtown San Jose, we also fear the Googleplex, because we've already seen a huge spike in housing just around the Googleplex that's proposed. It's years out, but many people are excited for the cost of housing. And so it's really important that we continue to look at that. One of the other areas that is really important that we could always use your feedback on, March 2019. Mark it on your calendars. March of 2019 is when the Burns & Associate will release their study on rate reform. And the rate reform they're looking at is all about sustaining the system. As Eric mentioned earlier, the system is successful in many cases, but it is under a lot of pressure. Burns and Associate was brought on by the department to look at the mechanisms employed by the state to support the vendors, and they've been undergoing a huge study over the course of the last year. The last piece of the study was in October. Hopefully you all participated in it. That was the family survey, where the Burns and Associate was getting feedback from that particular in order to make sure that whatever they propose to the state is going to be reflective of the community that is here. And if you didn't get it, then that is a question mark I'm going to leave you with. You should figure out, well, how do we get it? And many of us are going to be on a panel later, so that we'll be hosting a group. So how do we communicate that kind of information? And it is, everybody should have a voice. And that is your opportunity in that study. So look for rate reform from Burns and Associate.
Javier, we're going to move to Eric just because we're running out of time on this
Yes,
question.
thank you.
All right, go ahead.
And Eric's going to try to be brief, always a challenge for me. But the three of us to this side were at the National Association of Developmental Disability Directors conference in D.C., Washington, D.C. a week ago, maybe something like that, within the last 2 weeks. And one positive note is the idea of Medicaid block grants to states seems to have lessened or lost some traction. So that's an encouraging sign, because we're not quite sure how that would work with an open-ended entitlement for services. Can't guarantee anything, but it looks less likely now. But the two things I would mention out of that is immigration policy. Several of us, probably many in the room, might have been on a public charge, which is a immigration proposed change or reinterpretation that's going on that would really affect underserved communities. And as you saw from the data, our underserved communities are becoming larger and larger, and we're really trying to serve them. And then the professionalization of direct support professionals, so that really making the country, and certainly our state, look at the fact that the $4 billion that comes from the federal government has new expectations around community engagement and choice and kind of freedom and person-centeredness, but they need to fund that. And to fund that, we need to have direct support professionals, direct service staff seen as professionals and compensated at a rate different than In-N-Out burgers.
Very quickly, I would just add we need to do something about the Medicaid or Medi-Cal rates for dental and psychiatric services. It's critical. As you probably know, families are waiting 6 months or a year to get adequate dental services, and that has to change. On a positive note, I would just end this round by saying we now have more flexibility with our startup funding than we've had in maybe a decade or more. In case you don't know, regional centers were restricted in how we could use funding for development of new programs for just people coming out of developmental centers for quite a while. To the state's credit, they are now recognizing that there's a need to develop programs not just for people in developmental centers, but for everyone in the community. So we all
Let's be clear, it was like less than 1% of people in the system were in developmental centers. Yeah, but the programs were directed towards that 1%.
Correct. So I'm not going to get into that. We made a commitment to make sure people move out of developmental centers safely, and again, to the state's credit, we have done that. So, but now they are recognizing that pot of money was there, and now let's shift it and give regional centers a little more flexibility in how they create incentives for new programs to start. So it gives us more flexibility with the types of programs we can incentivize going forward. So hopefully you'll see some more unique and creative types of service development in the future.
Lisa, go ahead.
I just wanted to say one of the other things, I think when we talk about people not being able to afford housing and spending really large percentages of their income on their housing needs, I think one thing that is coming next July is that people who have SSI, SSP will be able to apply for food stamps, and that is a real change, and that should be somewhat helpful to people not having to get a large amount of their food from food banks and that sort of thing. So I think that is one policy change that has happened that we're looking forward to, just to mention.
That's called CalFresh.
It's CalFresh, and they're having a lot of meetings now about how that's going to be implemented for people with SSI, SSP. It used to be
What is
prohibited.
SSP?
It's a supplement to SSI
Oh,
based in
yeah, the
California.
California supplement. Sorry, yeah. Okay, great. We're going to move on to, there's just 2 more questions. The next question is, do you guys know what supported living services are? Anybody not know? Just in case you don't know, supported living isn't like a group home situation. Supported living means somebody lives in his or her own apartment, condo, house, and an agency, a supported living agency, provides support staff so that person can live, safely in their home. So, but there's been some debate over what is the setting, where those sorts of supports are fundable. So, what is your regional center's definition of permissible settings for SLS, supported living services? Specifically, what type of accessory dwelling units are allowed, and how are they defined under what regulation or policy? And we are very interested in ADUs because we see it as part of the landscape of choice that we're trying to attain, and also we live in this ridiculously expensive area where most people can't afford to go buy their kid a house.
Accessory dwelling unit is?
I'm gonna let them explain what ADUs are in their view. So let's start with Lisa.
So when we look at this, we look at the definition in Title 17, which talks about a unit that someone pays for, has a lease for, and that is not the home of a parent or guardian. And that's what it says. We do not have that much experience with anything other than some backyard cottages that people have had, which if someone has a backyard cottage, has a bathroom and has a kitchen in it, that will be considered a place where someone could receive supported living services. I think there's a new kind of accessible dwelling unit, which is the junior unit, which I actually just found out about very recently. And we don't have a lot of experience with looking at those in our area. But as with anything, we will take it on an individual basis when that comes up. The components of what the regulations say are your apartment that you lease or rent or own, and that it's not the home of a parent or guardian. So that's an interesting question if it's really attached to a home and depending on the interaction. So we haven't had that experience, but we will certainly look on an individual basis when those things come up, because as we look at diverse communities, we hear more and more about how important it is for families to be close. There are many situations and many cultures where people live in units that are fairly close to each other, or mother-in-laws, and that sort of thing. So we're open to looking at what's important for people to have.
Yeah, generally we are very flexible when it comes down to it. The basic tenet we start with is 4689, since we were asked of the Land Termination Act, the Welfare and Institution Code. It speaks to what exactly the definition of it. The tenet basically that it's a place where the individual either owns or leases on their own, and it kind of piggies on what Lisa mentioned. But one other thing we look for is making sure that it does have a kitchen, it has a bathroom, and it has a separate entrance. And those are the basic things we look for in that scenario.
And I just add, it's important to look at the ADU issue in terms of what supported living is. And I would say that there are no services that have suffered more in some ways from the freezing of rates and that breaking of connection between the cost of providing services and the rates paid for services than supported living and supported employment. With supported living, the idea is that the individual is the center of services. They're in control of property. They have a lease, that the services are created around them, that they're able to have influence on who they hire and fire with staff, and that it is a truly support and accommodation kind of model. And I don't have anything to add to what Lisa and Javier said. We take it on a case-by-case basis. The definition includes comparable dwelling to the community. So I'm looking forward in San Francisco to making the argument that a shoebox is now a rentable unit in any sense. Yeah, because the community standards have changed around that.
I agree with all of that. North Bay has the same approach. We want to make it work. So my last thing I would just say is come to us early if you're thinking of developing another dwelling on your property, so we can make sure it meets our rules and we can provide the service.
Thank you. Last question. Some clients, especially with autism and challenging behaviors, I have one of those at home myself, need one-on-one type programs, day programs, or even living programs, which are currently very scarce. I will say my experience, my son is 19, he's almost 20, and we asked our service coordinator what was out there that could provide one-on-one for him, and the answer was nothing. So I did enter him into the lottery for the self-determination program, and he was accepted into that. So that might be an option for him, but I'm concerned that that will be a lot of work, on my part, that maybe I won't be able to do. I'm not sure. But I would prefer that he were actually in a program where he and his behaviors could be supported. Self-determination is one option, but I want to know what are the spectrum of options for those? Not focusing on housing right now, but more on day and employment programming for those who have challenging behaviors. And by that I mean, like my son, property destruction. It could be aggression, could be self-injury, could be vocalization or other disruptive behaviors that wouldn't be tolerated in a normal place of employment. So I'm just going to throw that out there. Let's start with Eric.
Okay, since I am the coordinator of self-determination at Golden Gate Regional Center, where's Tiffany? Since the state, in its wisdom, has not chosen to provide any additional resources for regional centers to implement this important program. Anyway, self-determination. I just, and now I'm extemporizing. In terms of the idea for those who aren't familiar, the idea I think everyone, certainly on this panel, can get behind, which is get the control of resources closer to the person served and their family. We want that. The reality of the program, it took 5 years to get the federal government to sign off, and it's a requirement in our state law to have them sign off. It has definitely some limitations. It continues that in a sense, when you're in self-determination, you're still the payer of last resort because you need to use the money for services that we call generics that are already available, which might be good because it'll stretch your budget. But you also have to purchase services in settings that are HCBS compliant, which is sort of Gabriel was referring to in terms of intentional communities, but self-determination will have that. And then finally, to Jill's point, there is management around this. We did I think my committee at Golden Gate did 37 information meetings leading up to the first draw of this group that's going to go through the first 3 years. And it's that balance between wanting to get the resources closer to the people served and then recognizing these are state and federal tax dollars, and those come with some degree of monitoring and wanting to know how it was spent, whether it was spent. So there is going to be a burden or a challenge for individuals and families to be aware of how much they're spending over a year, because it is a limited amount of money based usually on your last 12 months of services.
Can I ask you a question? So if you don't have a last 12 months of services like us, so we're coming out of the school system?
Yes.
How is that level set? How is that funding level set?
There's an intensive person-centered plan which should come out with needs and areas, these 3 big buckets of services: health and wellness, living arrangement, and is the second bucket, and then employment or day, what you do for meaningful activity when you're not just at your house. It'll be established based on the average of similar individuals and their services. So it'll really be a person-centered plan that'll identify what your loved one needs and wants in terms of their support and aspirations, and then a look within our system of how similar individuals were funded by the regional centers if you don't have a budget already. Some of the upsides of it is it really, I think, will be valuable for folks who haven't been able to really be well served in our system. We just don't, we have a structure in regional centers and we're forbidden from some purchases, and for folks who just have never fit well in terms of what we have to offer, I think it will be good. It includes products as well as services, and we're pretty limited at regional centers in what kind of product we can purchase, and so you'll be able to use your self-determination budget for those kind of things. That's a whole presentation for hours and hours in and of itself, but every website, I'm sure, of our 3-4 regional centers has information about self-determination on it. And then in terms of your question, Jill, in how do you advocate for services, I have a very vague answer, and I'm sure my colleagues have much better specific answers, but our system needs to get away from the idea that the only place there's a reimbursable moment is when you're face-to-face with the individual. Especially in building local safety nets and statewide safety nets for people who we call the difficult to serve, that are challenging in their repertoires of behavior usually, and sometimes medical needs. We need to start funding some infrastructure, both with housing. We don't pay for empty beds, and that's been an issue, but also for services where the agency has time the service agency to train people and get them really well trained and also experienced before the individuals come. And that mechanism is going to be an advocacy push. We're starting to see it a little bit in the enhanced behavioral support homes and the community crisis homes, which are new over the last couple of years, where the funding has a component for what they know the home is going to cost the provider regardless of whether someone's there, and then a per-person funding. In the past, it's all been per person, so it's been very difficult without startup funding to build capacity before somebody moves in.
I think that self-determination is the great unknown in this state, so that's why as we got the name selected and we're going to have an orientation, train-to-trainer orientation from DDS sometime in the next month or so, we're going to see how things go as people enter the program. Yes, there was a previous program, but we're in a whole different time right now, and so I think we have to take the 3-year pilot as an opportunity to see what works and what doesn't work and what we're going to need to do to make changes. I think for individuals who need really specialized services, you're going to have to do, and the regional center working with you are going to have to do a lot of work as to what the individual needs are and how we're really going to meet those needs on an individual basis with a lot of creativity. And I think self-determination does offer the opportunity for creativity and doing something a little bit different. So I'm really excited about it. I do hope we get people who are excited about it participating so we can really see how it can work successfully in our area. And if you didn't get selected in the lottery, you didn't go through an information session, you still have an opportunity to do that because they will be selecting more people in the next year or two.
On the immediate side, we have the ability to do something called TDS, which is Tailored Day Service. And the Tailored Day Service is a one-on-one program for individuals. Not every community has them, but Tailored Day Service, when it works, the concept behind it is that 80% of a traditional day program budget would be allocated toward this TDS, which in turn would be able to come up with unique and other kinds of programming that is going to meet the needs of that individual. So that is something at your
Does each regional center have the
Each
TDS?
regional center has a variation of TDS. It depends on the vendors that we have. But yeah, there is TDS, and we have, I think, 4 vendors at our regional center that do TDS. But that is something you should explore on the immediate side for your loved ones. And then as far as the traditional model, we've always been able to supplement depending on the need of the individual, but we've been able to add additional staffing as appropriate to meet the either behavioral or other challenges that may be presented. So being able to have that discussion at that IPP meeting is something that I certainly encourage you to do. And then finally, regarding self-determination, the biggest, I think, thing for self-determination is the person will be able to go outside of the traditional service model to meet the individual needs of that person. What that ultimately looks like, we'll see over the next 3 years, but I think that's the biggest benefit, if there is to be one, is once a need is identified, you can go outside of the traditional service model and really get those needs met.
Just a couple last thoughts. You've mentioned that you went to your team and said, what services exist that can meet my child's need, and the answer was nothing. I just hope that the conversation doesn't stop there, because maybe something new needs to be developed. Maybe an RFP needs to go out. Maybe there needs to be a blending of different services. Maybe there needs to be an altered staffing ratio. I don't know, but nothing shouldn't be the end of the conversation. It should be the beginning, whether you're in self-determination or not. And then your other point was you don't know how much control you want to take or what capacity you have to really run that new model. I still think people should try it because it's a choice. You could get into the planning process, you could look at the new flexibility it offers, you could talk about what control you want or don't want, and then if it seems like it's a fit, you move forward. If you don't, you go back to traditional services. So I still think it's worth a conversation with your team. And the level of control you have can vary, both in terms of the financial management. There are different types of financial management services that are offered, so you can have more or less control depending on what your needs and wants
So
are.
to be clear, in self-determination, which hasn't really rolled out yet here, but there are two levels of control. One is the financial management, and one is the program management.
Right.
Okay.
So on the financial piece, there are different specific models that if you want the financial management agency to take full control and manage your budget, they can do that. Or if you want them to do pieces of it, they could do that too and partner with you. And then in terms of programming, another piece of the self-determination model is the independent facilitator. So if you want to be the independent facilitator, you could really go out there, negotiate rates with different providers, you could see what's available in your community, or you could designate someone else as your independent facilitator to do a lot of that work for you. You may or may not have to pay them, depending on who it is you pick, but that's another option that could influence how much control you have. Eric wanted me to mention that after the pilot phase of self-determination is completed in 3 years, self-determination will open up to everyone, so it'll be an option for the broader regional center population.
Thank you so much. Actually, we do have a little bit of, I have some announcements for afterwards, but we have about 5 minutes right now, so I will open it up for a few questions, which we'll try to go through really quickly. Oh my God, let somebody else ask a question. Okay, just quickly.
If you want to ask questions, stand up behind me. Okay, so when I was looking at the chart that, I can't remember her name, the very lovely lady was doing, about how 69% of the clients live at home if they're over 22 with their parents, and they're not entitled to SLS services because they reside with their parents. And then I was hearing Mr. Zigman say about how in the Welfare and Institutions Code it said Californians accept responsibility. I actually really think that needs to be changed, because it is not fair that when my kid turns 18, if he wants to choose to live at home, he cannot get supported living services. So basically he has to actively be displaced from his community to get it. So basically, hang on a minute. So basically Californians accept responsibility for people with developmental disabilities, unless they're the 69% that live at home and want SLS services. So guys, I don't think that's right. And if you guys think that's not right, you guys should join me, because we need to change that. That's not right.
Alicia.
Thank you. I have a question for all of you, but specifically for Javier, because you're my regional center person. And I would like you to explain the FHA a little more. Specifically, I want to know if FHA is like an adult foster care for an adult, why is it, or why can't that individual, why can't I get those supports for my son in my house? Why does he have to be placed in a foster home situation if he's fine at home? We want to keep him at home. Why can't I get those services at home, that support that I would need to keep him there? My son is sort of like the list that Jill mentioned about her son, except times 1,000. I'm not kidding.
Okay, which question do you want me to answer first?
Both. I mean, you choose.
All right, well, the FHA model is like adult foster care, and the whole tenet of the program is that a family brings that individual in, and the Land Term Act assumes that there is a certain responsibility of family members to care for their loved ones. So whether it's supported living, FHA, there is those traditional models may not be appropriate, therefore you're not going to be eligible for it, but that doesn't end the discussion. We can certainly talk about what are alternatives that we have that you can place into the home that isn't those two that may meet the needs of the individual, is my short answer.
And also the another question, I'm sorry, follow up, the TDS. Is there a specific age for that? Or my son is 17. I don't have that service. How could I get something like
Tailored
that?
Day Service assumes that the person has finished school.
Okay.
They're out of the IEP.
Okay.
Okay, Connie.
Okay. First of all, Theda, you took the words right out of my mouth regarding that. I just attended the National Association for Dual Diagnosis, and I want to tell you that in other states, the children can live with their parents, and there isn't this prohibition against SLS services in the home. Personally, I don't understand it because IHSS, coming from Medicaid dollars, allows us to provide, take services, the parents, but then the SLS, which also ultimately comes from funding from Medicaid, does not. So I hope we can change that. My other question, though, is regarding ADUs. I've been hearing around the state that because each regional center interprets it differently, there's been some issues with that. Like if a family wants to have a converted garage, make it an ADU, and then they'll be eligible for SLS services. In some regional centers, that's not happening. They're saying, well, you have to have a separate water meter, you have to have a separate address. All of those are barriers.
Already addressed this question, so quickly get to your
Okay, the question
just so
is
you can
how
have
do
one.
we change, how do we get standardization among the regional centers so that we can have more ADUs and junior ADUs?
I know there was a push for legislation around this. I don't think it got very far to standardize it. I would just say be careful, because when you standardize, that also takes away our discretion. So if you're gonna push to create legislation or something to standardize the definition, just be very, very thoughtful about how you define it.
Ravital, quickly.
Hi. I see that housing is a problem that everyone is dealing with. And there was an advice to start early. And I went to my SARC coordinator and I asked for, give me the options, take me for visits or tours. And I got an answer that unless I'm starting the procedure of taking my son out of the house, I can't get to see any place. And it was very weird for me because my son is only 16. I still want him at home, but I'm thinking of the future, and I want to see the options I have, and how can the SARC help me to see it? It's also.
All right. I think we got that. Okay, Javier, do you want to answer that quickly?
That is something we can talk about after. It's case specific, but in general, there's confidentiality around going out to visit homes, which is why we're pretty closed off when it comes down to just touring residential homes. But we can talk after.
All right, this is going to be the last question. Yael, you're going to be the last.
So this isn't about housing, it's about services that you receive while your child is still at home. I'm wondering why there's such a big discrepancy between even local regional centers about the services. For example, I'm San Andreas, sorry, picking on you, but and my son receives 24 hours of, say, respite a month. But my son has high needs, and if I was living in East Bay, I know people there get 21 days camp and 30 hours a month of why, and the caps have been removed, but when you try and request more because your child has high needs and can't be left alone for a moment, we're told that regional centers have that San Andreas has an exception to it. There's very little think that, well, why is there such
All
discrepancy?
right, we have 20 seconds for an answer.
I will just say that every regional center has their purchase of service policies that were approved by the board. However, every regional center has to look at things on an individual basis and have an exception procedure. And while we make exceptions around respite all the time, based on individual needs.